Welcome everyone to a new Cartographer office hours meeting. Today, February 7th, and I will share my screen right away. Yeah, and again, welcome, Mr. Scott Rosenberg. It's really great to have you here and have your input in all of this. Thank you.
Great to be here.
Awesome. Okay, for today's session, I already volunteered to be a note taker. Just feel free to add yourself to the attendance list. And then jump straight away into discussion topics, the RFC process. Yeah, there's been quite some discussion there in the PR. Most recent one was this proposal from Stephen. So I don't know if anyone else from the team would like to comment this.
I think the only piece of feedback or thought that I had on this was it seems like we could just make this a named committee right now. I've likened this to having like a bicameral legislature. It's the other house. It's just give it a name, and then instead of just saying the advantage being that then our processes reference abstract group. They reference interfaces rather than implementations. We don't have to reference Stephen Levine. We can just say like a member of this of XYZ group.
Any other feedback on this?
I remember mentioning there in that comment there that maybe the use of code owners can help with that. That I think is how, oh no, or with teams, I think maybe with the creation of like a sub-team in GitHub, we could create what Shum is proposing. Or like we could point at the, however we call that team to be the ones who do the final approvals, and then we could create a row that would allow us only to merge once folks from that sub-team accept it.
Yeah, one thing that I have wondered about, we have this, the voting options are affirmative, negative, and abstain. If we're trying to use GitHub's approval process for that, is negative like request changes or what?
I think generally, if you really want to say thumbs down and not hold off your vote until somebody, until things move further along or whatever, usually people do request changes and then say why they're doing kind of a thumbs down.
Okay. Any additional comment? Or is it, I mean, as a user, maybe I could infer that this whole RFC is approved? Is that okay? Right, okay. Cool. Got it.
Wait, sorry, what was that? I made a suggestion there for a change. Is that a change someone's going to make to the RFC? Or
yeah, I think we were saying like the one comment that we had when we talked about that change was just actually naming the group right now so that we can refer to the group rather than to individual names. But
got it. That makes sense. You shouldn't hit the merge button until we get the text looking like we want it to. Cool.
Right. Okay. Cool. Okay. Next topic in the agenda, RFC 9. It says approve.
yeah, just wanted to call out like voting has been going on for more than a week. There have been no downvotes, so we've put a story in the backlog to implement. So make sure no surprises. It's approved. Huzzah!
Down. Right. That's great. Anything else regarding RFC 9? Nope. All right. Looks like we have a new RFC draft, right?
Yeah, so this one's pretty quick. Yeah, a very good suggestion that Sarah made that had just come. You made the suggestion in the comments after folks had started voting. So it's like, okay, let's just separate this out. It's non-controversial. We should be able to approve this quickly. That is, right now, we have match fields as a selector under options. Options being what was introduced in RFC 9. And this is just saying, let's further include match expressions and match labels, which both target just the labels on the workload, no other field.
And then the eventual goal, right, is to have anywhere that you reference a selector to be the same usage everywhere, right? But the top level selector for supply chain is not covered by this RFC, right?
Yeah. If we didn't have anything else to talk about, I was going to bring that up next. Yeah. If we right now there are two selectors. You can have the selector, the top level selector, and the option selector, and they're different. And this does not cover that. It's just enriching the options selector.
And the only reason why it doesn't cover the top level selector is because that's a breaking change, right?
Yeah, this should be very straightforward. It's yeah, there's just an additive change. The other one, changing the top level selector, is breaking.
I see Scott had some comments on this. If you flip over to the code view. You'd want to go back to the RFC and then click over with that PR.
My comment is really just regarding the mutual exclusivity of matching by fields versus labels.
I was not aware that label selectors allow and match labels together with match expressions. I am yeah, I'm fine to switch that over. The whole goal is to match what the label selectors do on other Kubernetes objects.
Yeah, the difference is that typically you wouldn't combine a label selector with a field selector, but logically they are just handed together. So I don't know of any reason why we couldn't.
Right. This one is fairly new, but any other comment around this RFC so far? No. Okay. Cool. Well, as far as the agenda goes, this one seems to be quite different from other meetings. Really fast. So I don't know if there is any other topic that you would like to discuss here. No.
Yeah, I will call out that we're having a discussion tomorrow about snippets versus multipath. Multipath is an unnumbered RFC, and snippets is an old, the old RFC 5. Yeah, two different ways to attack the same problem. Scott Rosenberg, that is. I don't have your email address. I think otherwise everybody else that's on this, I've sent an invite to for that meeting.
Yeah. So there you go. There is his email. Cool.
The other thing that I would say, we've got RFC 18 and RFC 20, and there are two types of conversations that are going on. One is if we assume that we're going to do tracing, what's the best way to do it? And the other is what if we don't assume that we're going to do tracing? And so I posted in our Kubernetes Slack a suggestion that we take RFC 18, so RFC 18, a little history, came in as an external user RFC, it was RFC 14, and they put in like, here's the use case that I'd like to cover, and here's what I think is necessary, but they didn't necessarily want to be involved in like the entire shepherding process to get it all the way to approval. And so 18 is a rewrite of that original RFC 14, but crucially, both of them inherent in there is the need to say, this change that's made at one step in the supply chain, to be able to know at some later step, like, oh, this has gone through, like that change over there has gone through all these separate steps. And so that's what is being referred to as tracing. I think that we should vote on RFC 18, understanding that RFC 18 is proposing tracing, and that other implementations of statuses that we could have that don't get us tracing or don't require tracing don't actually match the use case for that RFC and would more properly be just introduced as separate proposals. And hopefully one of the things that can do is like, I think we've definitely had the conversations about like what are the upsides and what are the downsides to tackling tracing at all. And having had those discussions, we should like decide, are we going to do it or not? Because we do have users that are asking for it. And if we're going to deliver it in Q1, we should get on it.
Yeah, Tack, are you going to?
No, sorry, it was a vestigial hand. I put it down.
Okay.
So is there a perspective that we don't need tracing at all? Or like, or is the idea just, could we achieve tracing through reliance on the external tools, creating mappings between their, the artifacts they create, or, something that doesn't involve observed generation and that kind of mechanics, like saying CRDs have to present their inputs, things in spec and status if you want to capture them. When we say like, we don't want to do tracing, are we really talking about we don't want to implement observed generation based tracing, right? Or like some generic mechanism like that? Or is it even like we don't want to implement that, with a strong assumption that resources will support it, but we may want to implement that as an option that you can enable on some resources, right? Like I feel like there's a long like spectrum of, there's a world where we implement tracing just using observed generation, turn it on everywhere and draw an artifact graph and pretend like it's perfect. And that's probably not the right thing to do, right? And there's a world where we give up on the problem and don't, make any associations between resources at all. And that's probably not the right thing to do, right? Users definitely want the functionality. So to me, it's like, there's some things in RFC 18 I even like, some of like the option to use those RFC mechanics with observed generation when they work, right? To enable that to get tracing when it doesn't work. To me, like a path I might suggest is, can we look at this more like, individual tools you can use, some within Cartographer, some outside of Cartographer, that you can enable in order to establish the chain of custody all the way through, if that makes sense, as opposed to like a framework for establishing tracing that we believe will be always consistent, right? Is there a way we can, make it so that if you want to integrate external resources that don't behave correctly, the default isn't, oh, this thing is on and I'm going to assume it's going to start working. Does that sort of make sense?
I think I heard two important things in there. I guess the first is, there's Cartographer, which is a supply chain choreographer, and it is a tool. It's the backbone of a tool to create an app platform, right? And so presumably the app platform needs to be able to do tracing, and I think it's unquestionable that like you could write all of the CRDs that your supply chains, your Cartographer supply chains happen to point to, and just choose those CRDs to be like, I want you to expose this provenance information in a way that I can consume, and as such, boom, I've got a platform that gives you this tracing view. And to that, I would just say that's cool. Like, and it has nothing to do with Cartographer, right? It's the app platform deciding what are the resources that it's going to use. And the other alternative is the app platform says like, okay, I'd like this to be a responsibility of Cartographer.
I think there's something in the middle of those things though, right? It's like as an example, what if Cartographer just provided a way to capture provenance information, right, in the workload status, but didn't provide the mechanism for collecting it directly? Like you configure your template somehow, and your template, without using observed generation and trying to match status to spec, like as an example of one technique, it looks for an input in the output, right? And if it sees the commit next to the image digest, then it knows it can create a mapping between those. But there may be ways to capture that provenance information that are more abstract, right? Like there's every resources that implement some kind of attestation field, right? Cartographer picks up the attestation and goes and reads that and then checks the signature and records it, right? There could be generic interfaces that we can provide to capture the information that don't require the mechanics of tracing that I think people are rightfully worried about in some cases, right? But still, extend Cartographer to provide the interfaces for receiving that information and presenting it to the user. And I wonder if you could start with that, right? You could start with even just if the KPAC outputs the commit next to the image digest, then we can record that traceability information and then add more complex tools later, right? As we find, hey, a bunch of things implement observed generation and don't output their spec information and status. Therefore, maybe that's a useful tool that you can turn on optionally in a template when your resource implements that. Like, I think, sorry, got some hands raised, so maybe Scott's next.
Shame, if you want to respond to something Stephen said, go first.
Yeah, my first reaction is I'd be fine to define such an interface in Cartographer. I am skeptical that we have the clout necessary to go to the resources that are used even in our examples and to say, I need you to implement these. And so the nice thing about RFC 18 is that it relies really on things being well behaved from a more general, here, conditions are something that are recommended by the Kubernetes ecosystem as is observed generation. And so I'm much more comfortable relying on those pieces of information rather than saying hey, here's a new field. I'd love it if you implemented this, and then saying, if things implement this, then I'll provide that information to our users.
Please.
So I think there's a few different concerns that have gotten mixed up between these RFCs, and I will also fully admit that I have trouble distinguishing between exactly what's in RFC 18 and exactly what's in RFC 20 in my mind. But in general, I think to a point, tracing is a net good that we should encourage, and we should try to expose as much as we can until we're risking information disclosure about the contents of things that are being orchestrated that shouldn't be visible to the workload resource, to anyone who has visibility to that resource. So, I mean, anything within that bucket and metric, I think is a good, and we should explore the space and we should move forward with it. Where I have concerns is around parts of the proposal that are making changes to the actual runtime behavior of the supply chain. And I think we need to be very careful when we make changes to that, whether it be for the purposes of visibility or some other change, but that we fully understand the consequences of making that change in a mildly chaotic distributed system that is Kubernetes. Because we don't know all the resources that a supply chain will be orchestrating. We don't know the quality of the resources that a supply chain will be orchestrating. We know there will be a certain amount of chaos within the implementation of the resources that we're interfacing to. So I think if we expect too much from those resources, we're just going to be letting users down on the other side. Also kind of responding to something Stephen said about well, if we sort of enhance the contract to allow a resource to provide an attestation about the outputs, I think if your resource does that, great, that's interesting. But a cartographer can never require that to happen. Otherwise, it just will never be able to interface with any other resources that exist. So the question ultimately comes down to, how can we layer on this behavior and make forward progress and not block forward progress on sort of trying to solve the big picture problem? Because I think trying to solve for big picture at this stage is going to require a lot more due diligence than we actually have done so far for either proposal.
I want to address I think something I heard in what both of you just said is around our ability to capture provenance information without using, without assuming that, observed generation works, right? Like to capture if, assume a spec shows up in status or something like that, and whether we can expect that from tools in the ecosystem. So currently, we orchestrate KPAC and convention service is like two primary, components to do a build. KPAC actually kind of does expose this information already, but it puts it on the image, right? And so that, you'd have to have a very complex selector there, right? That says, well, Cartographer, go look at this artifact in this registry using the service account, right? But it is information that's exposed through that process, and convention service is, kind of joining the project, and we have an option of extending that, right, to show that information. To me, it doesn't seem unreasonable for both of those tools to provide more metadata about the artifacts they're building, right? I think other, I don't think we can make an assumption that everything you plug into Cartographer will do that, but it doesn't seem, I don't see a disadvantage in providing the ability through the template resource to, if that information is available, collect it, in a way where we can achieve that, kind of, or we have a place to centralize that traceability information on the cluster. That doesn't seem like a bad outcome, right? I think this is a problem that there are some resources that exist where they will never, or there are theoretical resources that exist where it's just not going to be possible to achieve traceability because whoever maintains them doesn't care about that, right? I don't think we're ever going to solve that. They don't have observed generation because it's just, optional convention in the ecosystem you can implement, doesn't, report anything about the inputs and the outputs because the author decided not to. So I don't think it's a problem that we will ever be able to solve where we can say, if you're using Cartographer with anything in the world, you're going to achieve that graph, right? But I do think that for the tools we care about, and potentially more of the ecosystem that implements observed generation, if we're willing to make it a template author concern to say, yes, I understand that this tool provides this information through this mechanism, I think we should make it easy for that template author to turn that on. And through that, we can ship supply chains, right, that do provide that traceability and provide interfaces for when they don't, representing, you only got part of the tree here, sorry, if that makes sense. I don't see another, real, like I'm not sure what else we would do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. So one, Scott said at one point, like, what's the difference between 18 and 20? And I think 18 is simply to say, like, commit ourselves to, we're going to do tracing somehow, some way, we're going to do it. And then 20 is defining, like, here's how we should do it. And so I think that part of the thing that's useful in this conversation is Stephen's pointing out, like, here's another way that we could do it. And so that would be, RFC 21, like, just a separate implementation proposal for how to report that. And so that, yeah, I think it would be valuable for us to ratify 18 and say, we're going to have this from field. We're going to figure out how to do it. Let's go. I think one thing that may make sense to drop into 18 is to talk about it can only ever be a best effort. No matter what schema we come up with, we don't control the API server. We don't have rules that we can say, like, oh, a user can't submit some object that doesn't, some controller that doesn't conform to our expectations. So we should have some idea that that field is there when we can provide it. And so whatever implementation we do is always going to be a best effort implementation. in terms of, and then a separate issue, and this is far more on the actual implementation side. Stephen, you had noted that KPAC exposes a latest image, and then there's actually like a build object somewhere in the cluster that like has way more detailed information. That's great. I would say that Runnable is also like that. Runnable exposes some output from generally Tecton task runs, pipeline runs, and then those task runs and pipeline runs do exist on the cluster somewhere. And so if you're a human with like access and like decent reasoning skills, you can like put them together. But neither of those objects, neither Runnable nor image, make that connection explicit, nor does Cartographer right now have any. This would be the first time that Cartographer would be looking at an object that it has not created, that it's not in some way an owner of. And so that's not a statement we shouldn't do it. I think that is a totally plausible path forward.
I wasn't saying that we should implement, cross-resource introspection, just that I don't think there are very many barriers to having all of those, having Runnable, with its integration with Tecton, having convention service, and having KPAC all report the more information besides the image. Like for instance, in KPAC's case, in the image resource, provide both the digest and the commit. Like those are all teams we, can talk to, all software that, we have, that kind of where the people working on those projects, use Cartographer also and understand, like what those needs are, right? I don't think there's a big barrier to, at least for the components we have now, implementing this whole thing without having to implement, like getting traceability without having to implement observed generation. I just worry that it's not going to work as we expand out into the ecosystem, if that makes sense. And I think the observed generation thing there could be a helpful tool in that case. Although if we need to implement cross-resource selection in Cartographer, I'm not opposed to that either. I'm just saying, I think that there may be an easier path.
Oh, but on the comments I just mentioned there, that for Runnable specifically, yeah, it's simple to tie inputs with outputs because you have total control over the outputs, right? So as long as, you implement it in a way that in your outputs you have the inputs, boom, you have them tied together, which means that for anything that is like a run once, we can have that contract very well defined, but then for a KPAC image, then we need something more elaborate.
Wishima, you muted.
Sure, I think you're suggesting that it would be easy for the author of a particular Runnable to create outputs, and like one of the outputs would just be like, here were my inputs. Is that what you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that is totally right, and I hadn't thought of it. And at the same time, I'm a little wary of like placing the responsibility on those individual Runnable authors. I'd want to come up with something more robust.
So it's an interesting comment about like more robust, right? Like on one hand, I could see like having to provide all the inputs and the outputs seems like a very specific, like kind of thing. On the other hand, though, like because the resources, follows this kind of declarative contract where you have a specification, you have status attempting to match the specification, right? And like there are some things like observed generation that can let you say like, yes, I think this spec is reflected in the status to some extent, right? Like I don't know, it doesn't necessarily feel wrong to me, right? Given that it's not like a request response system, right? That's very, where you have that kind of strong association, right? It doesn't seem that unreasonable to me to put more information in the status about provenance of the artifact. Really, it doesn't bother me that much.
Yeah, when I was saying more robust, I meant simply that if we're relying, like, I want to reduce the surface of misconfiguration, and I would not be at all surprised if, because Runnable can like stamp out arbitrary things, we actually do need to give the users the ability to say, like, yeah, here are the arbitrary things that would count as an input, because there's no way you would know them otherwise. It wouldn't shock me if we ended up there, but my hope would be that we could standardize enough that users wouldn't have to specify that, because if we ask users to specify it, some of them are going to misconfigure it, and then they won't get tracing, which we think is a really important goal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Joshua, please.
So I'm kind of still confused on where we landed. If I could summarize here, it kind of seems like, Stephen, you're mostly pro RFC 18, right? Because this kind of falls under the category of let's do something, because doing nothing is not our best foot forward. But it seems like, Scott, you're more of the opinion that we should do nothing because we don't have enough due diligence, I think, as you put, to do something. Can we try and reconcile like those two opinions?
No, I absolutely did not say do nothing.
Oh.
I think it depends on what the actual goal is and what we're saying that we're doing. So anytime we're proposing just surfacing information that exists onto the workload resource to make it easier for users to discover what's happening, that's good. No issue there with me at all. My concerns are when we're talking about changing the runtime semantics of the supply chain. And that's where I think the bar to propose a change to the runtime semantics is much, much higher. So if we're talking about modeling the chaos that exists today within the supply chain, where we don't know that input A triggered output B, trace away. Like it is a reflection of the current state of the system. Go nuts, surface as much information as you are comfortable surfacing. If we're talking about changing the semantics of Cartographer so that we can start to actually answer the question with certainty, the input A triggered output B, that's where my concern is. And that's where I think we need to tread much more carefully.
But it's the part of RFC 20 where we say, hold the spec update, right? That's suddenly, trying to do more than, or if we do anything around that, we have to be very careful about understanding what the implications of those changes are.
Yeah, and there are parts of RFC 20 that I think are fantastic, independent of anything related to tracing. Like being able to watch a resource that was stamped out to notice when it has a problem and being able to serve that on the workload to a user. That's like, yes, we absolutely need to do that yesterday. So I think like there are a lot of really good parts of it, but just the overall totality of the RFC, I have trouble with.
I'm personally still not opposed to, in a limited, like in a controlled way, in a opt-in way, when you understand those implications, right? Adjusting the runtime semantics, right? Holding spec, if we really understand what those outcomes are and can align on them. So I'm still not opposed to, going down that route, or I think we should continue to investigate that, because I don't think every resource we find is going to implement, showing, providing that traceability, moving spec to status of inputs. But it seems like we're all aligned that RFC 18 is good, and that we should talk more about 20. Maybe while we're talking about 20, figure out other ways we can achieve traceability that don't require some of that additional complexity, like changing the runtime semantics. Does that seem right?
Scott, are you okay with RFC 18 as written? Because it seems like you proposed something that was fairly different.
I need to go back and reread RFC 18 to like really kind of focus it on like in isolation to really be able to answer that question. There were certainly parts of it that seemed good. There were parts of it that are a little suspicious to me, but I will go back through and put comments on things. It might also just be there are parts of it I didn't understand. So it's not to say that things are necessarily wrong.
Cool, thank you.
Did we, in RFC 18, did we resolve, at one point a version of this had, it looked like it was an artifact graph. It had the different stages, but the artifacts weren't actually connected to each other. Has that been addressed? Or like, I remember there was some conversation like that, but it was a while ago.
My contention is if the artifacts are not connected to other artifacts, then it's not RFC 18. But the use case that's proposed says I need to know when change X at step N became change Y, like when that's propagated down to step N plus 3. And in order to do that, you have to connect artifact to artifact to artifact.
But we can't connect those artifacts yet, right?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. The subtle, like, RFC 18 is committing ourselves to finding some way to do that. We can't implement, like, we need to find some concrete implementation that we're going to agree to do. But my sense had been that there were some conversations about let's propose like some reporting out that doesn't do that connection, and those don't fulfill that goal. Those don't fulfill tracing. So again, 18 is let's have some trace, like let's connect artifact to artifact. Let's essentially enable tracing, and then 20 is here's a way that we could make it. Here's an implementation that would allow us to connect those artifacts.
So if RFC 18 were approved, we couldn't do anything until subsequent. We couldn't actually implement anything until subsequent RFCs were approved that specified how RFC 18 would get implemented.
There's there's some piece of 18 that we could implement, but we can't implement the from field until we decide how are we going to determine what artifact came from, what output came from what input.
I'm a little hesitant to approve an RFC, or like, is there a reason to approve it if it can't be built yet, sort of? Like, is there a way we could work on this more, smaller things that we can build on top of each other?
I'm probably in the minority here, but I have a looser interpretation of RFC 18, which I've talked about with Washuma. And that's the sense that everything that we model in RFC 18 in the status is actually a tuple, right? Because we have a reference to the output as well as the resource. And so to me, I think it's still possible to actually connect all of those tuples together into a graph. And using the same syntax in the from field. But to me, the missing piece that RFC 20 provide is like an additional piece of information in the from field, whether or not like the link you're making is a causal link or not. So to me, there's like nothing else changes from RFC 18, but once we add RFC 20, then like you can say in the from field that like this is causal or not. Like,
I think what I hear is you want to build an artifact graph that is wrong.
But that's my point, right? It's a resource graph, and sometimes the outputs from that resource graph are causal, and sometimes they're not, right?
And to be clear, I think there's value to be had there, but it's not the value that the requester had. It doesn't match the story, the motivation that's written in RFC 18 that came from our users. So that right there is why I want to approve 18, because I want us to nail down, are we doing that thing that was asked for in RFC 14 when they came to us and they said, I really need to know when this change that's made over here finishes going through the supply chain, we want to fix that problem for them, or do we want to fix a different problem, which is something like, hey, I'd like to build a visualization tool on top of Cartographer, and it's really valuable to me to just like know what resources connect to what resources.
Yeah.
I'm 1,000% on board with solving that, like answering that question. I just want to push things along.
Yeah, sorry. Before Scott, there was a question from Raj in the chat. Is following events for traceability a no-no?
This was that's why I put it in chat, was just because it's a bit of a sideband question. You know, Stephen was talking about other ways to solve,
Okay.
other ways to solve traceability, and I was just wondering if we're allowed to watch events and so that we don't hold anything up, but still know we may be able to use events to work out what caused something else. But it's the first question I have is, should we even look at events, or is that just a quagmire? Scott probably knows better than anyone.
Right.
Shorter answer is it depends. There are times where replaying events in history is extremely powerful and useful for reconstructing, like just tracing through what happened. Like that's why we have logs. But is it appropriate to read through those events and then try to reflect status onto the resource itself and pretend that it actually is accurate to what the system is doing? That's more suspect. Worth thinking through though. That's just my gut reaction. The question why I raised my hand was around the notion of approving RFC 18 as is. Like, I think there's a lot of value in having high-level RFCs that lay out first principles, independent of concrete actions about how we implement things. But I think when you do that, you have to be very careful to kind of scope it to be big picture, to not be trying to propose any solution, but just sort of saying, here are our statements of belief. I don't think RFC does that. Sorry, I don't think RFC 18 does that today. I think it gets too deep into proposed solutions to actually be effective at that high level. But like if we were to rescope it to sort of like, here's what we think about tracing. Here's what we think about provenance and attestation. Like, it's not necessarily the be all end all, like it will certainly evolve over time, but like putting a stake in the ground and saying like, these are our core tenets that we will try to build to over time. I think that is good.
I definitely agree with that. Like, if RFC 18 were a commitment to solve the problem, right, and went into detail about what problems we're trying to solve, then I wouldn't have an issue. I'd be like, yes, that sounds great. We should definitely agree. I definitely agree with that path forward. And in other projects, I've seen similar kinds of RFCs that are around, you know, outlining a high-level strategy, but it's the presence of that artifact graph, you know, that's very concrete, without a way to implement that gives me some pause. Part of one thing I heard earlier is there may be two use cases that we're thinking about. One is like artifact tracing, and the other is like being able to say this turned into this, turned into this. And there's another use case that maybe doesn't need that tracing exactly. It's around visualizing connections between the resources. And I know of one user at VMware that would be interested in kind of that ability to visualize those connections between the resources, even if we didn't have artifact tracing. But I wonder, I don't know if that needs to be combined with the artifact tracing functionality, right? To me, like right now, it is really hard to understand the supply chain without the traceability, because you have to follow the workload to the supply chain and then parse the supply chain graph and then go back to the workload and look at the child references and see what got created, you know, especially once we have that conditional logic in there, right? Where the supply chain won't deterministically figure that out, right? Like we have like nothing right now, right? We don't solve either of those problems. And so I just want to call out, like, I think it's great if we can solve that resource connection problem also, but I don't see a reason to combine that with the same functionality as the artifact graph, because they are pretty different things, right? And both are going to be really important, because once we have conditional logic in the supply chain, like something that's attempting to easily draw a graph of those connections between resources without the artifact information should be able to retrieve what are the resources that are created and how are they connected together.
The reason I start to reason about them in like the same breath is because even if we take RFC 20 as a given, right, we're going to hit these situations where like we possibly can trace an artifact up to a point in a supply chain, and then maybe there's like a bad actor resource in our graph that we can't trace past. And so then like what do we like? How do we illustrate that, right? And to me, that means that we probably want to illustrate it as like potentially like a break in the line, right? Where it's like we know we can trace the artifact up until this point, but then after that, all these other resources, all we can tell you is that this is the latest thing we know about, right? I think like that split view is potentially something that's still beneficial to users. And so that's why I think that artifact tracing and visualizing this graph are the same problem.
But I don't see why we couldn't accomplish, like, draw the perfect resource graph that always shows the connections between the resources in separate JSON from the JSON that describes the association between the artifacts. And then you always can draw if you're trying to draw the resource connections, you can use one blob of JSON, right? If you're trying to draw if you're trying to understand the artifact graph and the associations between the artifacts, which may actually, because it may be dependent on previous different states of the supply chain, like the connections between the resources could have looked different, right? Like it feels like it's better to decouple those things, draw one graph, and then overlay information about the connections from the artifacts on top of it, as opposed to combining them together. Like I feel like it's going to get really complicated to maintain a merged version of that as we deal with the supply chain dynamically changing over time, right? And needing to preserve the associations between the artifacts, needing to preserve that it passed through these steps that no longer exist, right? And providing a current view of what the supply chain looks like. But maybe I didn't understand the motivation for combining them completely either.
I just think it's the same information in both cases, right? It's like you have tuples, right? You have a resource and you have an output, and like it really just comes back to this idea. It doesn't even really depend on what's in the supply chain anymore, right? Because it's it's the object stamped out under the workload. But it's this idea that I basically want to draw a graph of tuples, and sometimes like one causes something, and sometimes you're just showing the latest of something else. But the way you want to reason about it in a visual, to me, is just the exact same in both cases. It's like drawing a solid line between two things versus drawing a dotted line between two things, right?
I think if you think of the artifact graph as just this. Oh, sorry, you had your hand raised. I should.
Yeah, please.
Oh, well, one, I don't remember why I originally raised my hand, but yeah, I think Josh, we've talked and you'd made the case that I think I only made the first half of reflected earlier, which is it's always going to be a best effort, and doing the tracing from artifact to artifact is something that we can only do given a well-behaved resource. But we can always say, yeah, I don't know which version of this object exactly gave some inputs to my next step, but I am reading some state from this and pushing it over. And so given that well-behaved, or given that poorly behaved resource, that poorly behaved node in the graph that can't say, hey, I'm from the third output of that object, we can't always say, hey, I'm from some output of that object. And I'm not opposed to having those two graphs, or those two pieces of information are like really similar. If you're saying like this artifact is connected to this artifact, a subset of that information would be enough to say this artifact is connected to this object, some artifact from this object. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Right, please.
With time running out, it feels like I'm only going to add more questions and answers. So I might leave it there and find out if there's anything we need to do next instead.
Questions are good.
It feels like we're going to be at this for at least another week. So getting questions out there sounds like a really valuable thing.
One of my top level questions is can we we talk about an RFCs for sort of like high level design goals, and I feel like a high level design goal that will be valuable and I will write up as an RFC is to have deterministic supply chains, and that includes knowing the specific type that they produce as a resource type, so that we can know ahead of time without actually pushing to the API server, to Kubernetes. We can know ahead of time what shape the supply chain takes. That's information that we can reflect on the workload. We can reflect on a supply chain and say this supply chain will take these different shapes depending on like pathing information, and that's something I've been working on. And I think there is good reason to have that information separate but the same, and the main reason is because I see with more of our ways of optionally choosing a path for a given workload, the workload collapses the uncertainty, right? You go from a quantum state to something that's reified. And so this reified object that you have is going to represent something that can absolutely invalidate the artifact graph. I still think anything that's in the artifact graph that's no longer valid would still be easily linked. So the artifact graph should be able to say, I went through this object that's no longer there, then to this other one. But there should still be a truth as now selected for the workload, something that we can observe. So those are my thoughts. And I will definitely try at some point soon to, because I've been wondering, how do we talk about high level design goals? And I feel like having a deterministic supply chain would be incredibly valuable. Help us get people to demur on using YTT for all sorts of things and just use it for the things that our templating doesn't support, like looping and interpolation, rather than making choices, which I think we can make at a higher level and make it much more deterministic. So that's I think it will raise questions stuff, but that's what I wanted to throw into that.
Okay, great. Great conversation today. So, well, that's it. We are at the top of the hour. So thank you for joining. Thank you for all your input, and see you next week. Bye.